Good morning. I'd like to welcome you to the monthly work session. Today is October 17th, 2023, and the start time is 10 o'clock, I think, because I can't see that with the glare. Today we will be doing the superintendent's evaluation, and I will kick it over to Mr. Connor to introduce and then walk through our process today.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you, Board. So this is a part of my contractual agreement is to establish this work session to talk about the evaluation rubric and objectives for the superintendent on an annual basis. So you all had the opportunity at our last retreat to meet Mr. Pete Gorman, who is here to help assist and facilitate our session today. So I have provided you last week with a draft of a rubric and some preliminary objectives and goals. At this point, we'll have time to go through that extensively, but at this point, I want to kick it over to Mr. Gorman, Dr. Gorman, and allow him to take over and facilitate this session for us.
Great. Thank you all very much for the opportunity to be here with you again, and I thoroughly enjoyed the last chance we had to be together. And I'd like to walk you through the layout for today. We're going to start off by looking at your policies that impact the superintendent's evaluation. This work is rooted in that and stems from that. Then we're going to look at setting the stage, what makes a high-quality evaluation process for a superintendent of schools. Then I'll turn it back over to the superintendent where he'll go over areas to evaluate that are recommended. It is a draft, certainly open. Any item is open for feedback, of course. Then we'll look at the format in the rubric, and then we'll close off by talking about the process. And that's an incredibly important part, the format, the rubric, and the process, because there's got to be some agreement amongst board members for how that process will work. And in our business education, I want you to think about how difficult it is with grading in schools, in classrooms. This is linked in a similar way to that. What is an A for one board member, an A perception of another board member, a B perception of a third board member, a C perception? There's got to be some work that is done where you triangulate around that and understand how the process will work and what constitutes the gradations and things like that. So we'll get into that at the end. That will be a challenging part. And it's difficult because each board member brings their own experiences, their own expectations. And we'll get to that later in the day. But let's jump in then right now and let's start off with your evaluation policies. Begin with the fact that your contract compensation and benefits policy includes the fact that you will lay out evaluation in the contract. And on item 3.202, very briefly heads into it, but then in 3.1, you start to dive into it. And you have something I've never seen in a policy. I've never seen a policy that cites October 17th for a magic date to do something. And I wondered, how in the world did that get there? And your superintendent filled me in on that. Mr. Superintendent, will you just...
So today marks the third month, 90 calendar days since my employment began here in Sarasota County.
So the goal was that within 90 days, you would lay out what this evaluation process looks like, et cetera. And I'm not going to read this all to you, but it will transition then in the calendar, in the contract going forward, to be end of October to complete the process, and end of September for your superintendent to have some due dates to get you information so you have enough time to act on it. So you will now move into a regularly scheduled cadence with dates and times laid out. And that's incredibly important looking at how that lays out. And I'll talk to you in a moment about that. And this gets into further clarification 3.2. And then item 5, though, 5.1 links it back to his contract, and also his contract is specifically linked to performance incentive bonuses that he is eligible for. Those performance incentive bonuses that he's eligible for are linked directly back to the evaluation, so this all needs to be done in a timely manner. Any questions about any of the policy, any of those areas? You are completely within the timelines. You're in great shape with that. You're progressing. Any questions on that? All right, well, let's set the stage. If you're looking at a best-in-class system, evaluation needs to be part of a comprehensive accountability system. And when you think of a comprehensive accountability system, it starts with the superintendent, and then it should work its way outward. So you have the ability, although you don't directly supervise and evaluate other staff, you have the unique ability to impact in a great way how that happens for other individuals in the district if you are systemic in your approach. If you are not systemic in your approach, you don't get to impact those areas and things are out of alignment. What do I mean by that? Well, you need alignment from an evaluation system, because if you don't have that alignment, things don't cascade outward from the superintendent to others. So I'll give you an example of it, and I'd like to think of it like a relay race. I work with the superintendent who, when they got the job as superintendent, said to the district leadership team, "You are so lucky to have me as your superintendent." They said that on the first day. And people were taken aback. And they said, "Wow, that is a pretty egotistical comment." They said, "Well, I have to tell you that because the board chose me to be superintendent because they wanted to move in a different direction regarding student performance, transparency." They listed a whole series of things. And they said, the superintendent said, "I have pulled the evaluation and accountability metrics from the district, and the district has unfortunately been declining in performance. There's distrust from the public, a lack of transparency, facilities projects are late and over budget. There's a whole series of things that are really trending in the wrong way. But when I pulled the evaluation documents for everyone at the district office, everyone's a 5 out of 5. Everyone." And when we looked at principal feedback, everyone was at expectation or exceeds expectation. So you're lucky to have me because you're running a relay race, and I guess everyone everywhere did a great job, but when they handed it to the superintendent, who the board chose not to renew, they must have dropped the baton because everyone else is doing great. Now, that superintendent telling that story was being facetious, saying, "I know that's not the case, but there's a lack of alignment. There is a lack of alignment in doing that work." And I like to think of it like, have you seen those nesting dolls? Picture you've got the child at the center, because our work is to surround our students and children with the support and learning and great things that they need. And surrounding them is the teacher. And surrounding the teacher is the site-based leadership team. Principal, assistant principal, anyone that provides instructional support, front office, all those folks that make it work. Surrounding them is great district office staff that provides support. Surrounding them is the cabinet of the district. Surrounding them is the superintendent of the district. When those items are in alignment, remarkable things can happen for a school district. I know you're doing a refresh on the strategic plan and some other pieces. That will come in play as well to make it even more effective in doing that. Now, why do I say that? Because when strategic plan, department plans, and school plans are in alignment and you're moving in the same direction, you are clear from a district what is held tight and what is let loose. And this is where you as a board have the ability to influence what goes on in a school district and focus it. To focus it on what is important for this community and set standards and expectations. Because from each level, when you connect it to another level, if there's not alignment, if there's not the continuity and flow through, it's like a hose. Where do hoses leak? Hoses leak at connection points. And if you're not aligned in that, you're adding more connection points. And there's more opportunities for things to leak. So you have the unique ability to shape and put in place an accountability system that a superintendent's evaluation is a key driving point. Now, I like to think of it as the slide says. The best way for boards to approach the topic of CEO evaluation is not think of evaluating the CEO at all, but think of evaluating whether the organization has achieved what should have been achieved and avoided what should have been avoided. If you're in alignment, that's how you can look at that. If you're out of alignment, then we're individually doing a series of one-off things. And that's where you end up not having that connected, that relay race type of approach. Now, if you look at next perspective slide, when the board's defined organizational success, it is logical, reasonable, and just good common sense for the superintendent to be evaluated on the basis of organizational performance. When you think about it, not much makes sense at all. But that only works if you have set expectations and you have seen that the goals of the strategic plan are the right goals and there is that alignment. The places that function at high levels do that. Now, there's one other piece that comes to play I want to share, and that is Pearson's Law. And Pearson's Law says when performance is measured, performance improves. When performance is measured and reported back, the rate of improvement is accelerated. We're not talking about an environment of fear or I'm threatened to lose my... What we're talking about is we're watching, we're paying attention, and we've said to folks, this is what is important to us as a community. We've got to make sure that we go beyond effort when we do this type of work, though. Effort is good, but results are better. And here's the challenge. In our business, all too often, we grant effort points to adults and results points for kids. I tried hard as an adult. What are we delivering for students, though? That's what matters. And clarity is incredibly important. We don't want to have the moment where we shoot the arrow and then we draw the target around it. That's why these dates matter. By the way, you may, at some point in time, look at that and you may decide to change your dates. You may want to ratchet up into summer. But here's a challenge. If you're not going to get state assessment data back, you're where you need to be.
I will say, historically, then this has been a massive improvement over probably 8 years when you think about the evaluation and hitting timelines. But as we do go forward, and it is unusual, but thank you to our council to ensure that it is in policy and it was written in a manner where we would be able to force ourselves and create kind of that habitual organizational structure. But to your point, there is a risk at the same time because we're starting the school year, and so if we do need to reverse engineer it a little bit more, I think we may want to consider that after the first year. So good point.
Yep, and I just don't think you can do it now because you're not getting the data. So you're right where you should be for right now. Yep. Now, with that, clarity counts. Remember, good is not a grade, some is not a number, and soon is not a time. You've got to know what it is that is expected. Because your good may be different than your good, different than your good, and your good. And he works for the Board of Education, not a board member. So he needs to know the board's expectations. And in doing that, the more visible you make your thinking, the more clear you are, the more accountable he can be, because transparency is the road to accountability. Whenever possible, make your thinking visible, which is why Mr. Connor may frequently ask you when you tell him something, you want something done, can you please share with me what constitutes evidence of success? What is it? Because I don't want to come to you with A and you tell me you wanted B. Now, he's not asking you to tell him how to get to B, but he's asking you to tell what constitutes evidence of success. So in doing that, a phrase I used with you the last time I was here, that's why he wants to know the rules of the game, the score, and how much time is on the clock. And that's what we're doing today. So let's jump in and look at what the process of evaluation for a school superintendent involves. It involves standards. What are the standards that you want to evaluate the superintendent on? Now, you've got the case in the state of Florida that there are, 8. Thank you. I was just checking my number. Thank you. There are 8 standards that are laid out. There are 8 standards. You are not required by law, as I understand it, to adopt those 8 standards. But it is a strong framework for you to work from. You then set expectations. Setting expectations gets into what does that standard look like for Sarasota County schools. From there, then, you set goals. And those goals will be both professional and personal. There may be pieces for him personally for his growth and development. You can add on pieces to that. You're not limited to that. And in doing that, the more frequently you link it back to student academic performance, the more alignment there will be. The more alignment there will be. Then comes time for assessment. And the assessment, make the superintendent work hard before the evaluation happens by giving you a self-assessment. He should show you evidence of success. It is not on you to be the originator of the first look at that. The superintendent should give you that, and should give you that in a manner where you can crosswalk it or link it back to the standards. Yep. Got it. And in doing that, you don't have to accept all of that data. You could say, we interpret that differently. Scrutiny comes into play, but the great divining rod to tell you if you're on the path to that is student data. That's what is the great connection when you get into student data. And we're talking student data in a multitude of ways. We're talking proficiency, we're talking gap closure, we're talking subgroup performance, we're talking about things like for a high-performing school, percentage of students in the 3rd quartile who move into the 4th quartile. We're talking about kids below standard who get above standard. There's a multitude of ways to look at that information. And then there's the process. The context of the district comes into play. At different times, we have been through recently all sorts of interesting times. The context will impact it. That is your job to interpret context. It's your job to interpret context, though, and to share with the superintendent to make sure he's clear on your interpretation of context. There shouldn't be guessing for that. It should be very clear. And in you analyzing that context, that's where then you look at those standards and you'll determine whether there'll be outcome or process. At different points in your career as an individual, you may be more process than outcome oriented. When would that be? Well, we'll get into that, but more first year. Because sometimes you have to put foundational pieces in place that are more process than outcome. but you don't always stay in that mode. You may morph over time and transition into different phases. You agree on the format, process, and calendar. Calendar's already decided for you. There's not that's contractual. From there, then, how proof will be determined, gathered, reported. How will you do as individuals? Will you individually score each item? Will you talk as a group? You agree through those items. Frequency. See, I'm a big fan of viewing it as a process. If I'm superintendent, every quarter I want to talk to you. I want to check in. Now, if we're going to do that, then we have to agree then on what is evidence of success, of milestones, things like that. If your intention is to lose, on New Year's Day, you say you're going to lose 30 pounds by the end of the year, you don't wait till December 31st and jump on a scale. You look at earlier, I'm going to start packing my lunch. I'm going to start packing my lunch and bring healthy foods. I'm going to start packing my lunch, bring healthy foods, and I'm going to start walk. You see the progress. So it may be during the year there are more process items, and end of the year more outcome based. So there's a progression that can occur. And then the final item, which is one I don't know whether you've thought of or not, you may also decide if you want to self-evaluate. How have we done? How have we done, and have we done things in alignment? I'm certainly not saying this is the case here, but I have seen districts where they end up looking back and saying, I'm not so sure we made the path as travelable as we could. All right. Now, as part of that process, the format, there's the SMART goal format. Agree on that evidence of success. The interim measures we did just talk about. Scoreboards are helpful. It's helpful to be able to see the scoreboard and know if you're on the path to get there. It's a good way to do that. By the way, though, you can't oversteer and overreact. You can't lose your mind because you're down a point at the end of the first quarter. There's 3 more quarters to play. So you got to be really thoughtful about that piece with scoreboards. And then what's the check-in cadence? And the check-in cadence is actually a little bit of a negotiation between all of you. When do you want to be updated? But also, Mr. Connors could say, but we're not going to get that info for a month from now. I asked that we wait and we move that to be a December 15th, not a November 15th. So it'll be a little bit of negotiation around that. And then, how do you calibrate? How do you calibrate? And this is a tough one. This is a tough one that you all are going to have some deep discussion amongst yourselves. And this could get interesting at times. How you're fair, consistent, and how do you compare? That when you look at a piece of evidence that you said the evidence was up front and someone says it meets it and someone says it doesn't meet that. That should also drive you then for the next year's evaluation to say, are there different ways we could be more clear in the future so we don't end up in the position we're in, that we have a disagreement whether this meets the standard or it doesn't meet the standard? How do we make it clear? And to be very direct with that, you will always have some gray. That's just the nature of this work. All right, in the first year evaluation, it's more likely to be process-based. Much more likely to be process-based because your superintendent is putting in place systems, processes, and structures, in many cases at the behest of you all. You all have made it clear. Everything from when you interviewed the superintendent and you asked questions, you were sending messages. What are you going to do about? How are we going to? And he paid attention through that process. He's developed a 90-day plan. He's learning things. There's a whole series of things that your first year, you may do it one way and you may morph it in the future. Are there any questions at all that you have around the setting the stage components? And either questions for me, but I also Madam Chair, turn it over to you. Is there any discussion the board wants to have about that before we move into the next phase of the evaluation overview, which I'll turn back over to the superintendent?
Any comments, questions? I'm just going to reiterate, I think just having gone through this, I think I can't underscore how important the process is. And of course, we're individually elected board members, but having some unifying and transparent agreement on what that looks like will allow all of us to walk away very pleased with this process and agreeing and committing to it. So, any other? Okay.
Okay, with that, I'm going to get up for a moment and I'm going to walk this out.
All right, thank you. So at this time, what we're going to do is take a moment to go over the evaluation rubric that is in draft form. I did provide this in advance to each of the board members for review about a week ago. And I want to start on page 2 of the evaluation, and I think we have this slide. It is an adaptation of the newly adopted, I say newly, October of 22, the state of Florida adopted 8 new leadership standards. As you see on this page, there are 9 because this was adapted to include board governance and policy. And really, this rubric was adapted towards superintendent evaluation. There's some specifics there, obviously, versus maybe a school-based or a district-based leader. But essentially, those standards all are connected for that cascading outward that Pete talked about, so that everyone within the organization, from the cabinet down through the district level, are consistent in terms of what is expected of them through these standards. Any questions around that? All right, page 3 talks about a timeline. So today, obviously, October 17th, contractually, the board and the superintendent are meeting to develop and agree upon the evaluation rubric and the annual goals. On our next regularly scheduled board meeting, we will formally adopt the evaluation, and then by each September 1st of my contract, I will complete the self-appraisal using the rubric and sharing evidence of success, of what constitutes success for each of that. And then by October 1st of each year, the board will individually complete the rubric themselves, and that will be aggregated, and I'll go through that process in a minute. There are rating descriptors here on page 3 that range from ineffective, developing, effective, accomplished, and distinguished. And then down below, a little bit of a description. So we'll go through the first bullet where it says each board member will rate the superintendent's professional practice in the rubric that is adapted from the standards. Board members will indicate their level that best describes the superintendent's performance in each area of using the descriptors above. The overall rating will be calculated based on a prescribed rating scale. The overall ratings will be combined to determine an individual board member rating, and then each individual board member ratings will be combined to determine a composite overall evaluation rating, and we'll go through that in just a second. In terms of the objectives, so those will be the annual goals and metrics that are tied to the incentive clause of the contract. The board chair and the superintendent would collaborate to evaluate progress towards meeting those goals. That will be in part 3. Each objective has an assigned percentage, and this is obviously in very draft. I wanted to at least provide the board a starting place, and we can talk about that. Upon meeting the objective, the superintendent will be awarded the full amount of the assigned percentage. If not, no progress towards the goal, then I would not be awarded. And then there is the possibility, depending on if we're making progress towards and we quite haven't got there, but we're over 50% there, there's a provision there to maybe be awarded half of that assigned percentage. And again, up for discussion and for the board. So turning to page 4 of the rubric, you see the first standard, and I know you've had a chance to go through this, so I won't go through each and every one of these, but standard 1, I'm sorry, I got to make sure I'm staying up with the click for those who are watching here. So, so standard 1 is around professional and ethical norms. So effective superintendents will act ethically according to professional norms and promote the academic success and well-being of all students. So there you see there you have 4 professional practice indicators there. Each one of the 4 would be would be rated, and then based on that rating, they have a numerical point value. So ineffective being 1 point, developing 2, effective 3, accomplished 4, and distinguished 5. So the max on this particular one would be 20 points, correct? So as that is aggregated, let's say I was able to get, effective across the board, that would be a total of 3, 3, 3, and 3 for 12 points, which would fall in an overall rating for this standard in the effective range, which you see at the bottom is 10 points to 13 points. So there'll be individual ratings for each component that will be then totaled for an overall standard rating. So there will be 9 standard ratings completed by each board member. So standard 2 being vision and mission, and you see there are 5 individual indicators there. Also want to point out on the side in the blue shaded area are just possible evidences of success criteria. These are not exhaustive lists at all. That we can, certainly we can talk and have discussion if there's something that we'd like to see explicitly on this document. But I just went ahead and put some things that I thought would be a good starting point. So then going to standard 3, we have school operations, management, and safety. And as you can see, there are 9 indicators there. Standard 4 is student learning and continuous school improvement with 7 indicators. Standard 5 would be the learning environment with 4 indicators. Standard 6, recruitment and professional learning with 7 indicators. Standard 7, building leadership expertise with 4 indicators. Standard 8, meaningful parent, family, and community engagement with 4 indicators. And then lastly, Standard 9, which would be board governance and policy with 5 indicators. So as an individual board member were to make each rating for those individual indicators, all of the standard ratings would then be aggregated for an individual board member rating. And then that would be done on page 13. Obviously, there are opportunities for comments on each of the standards individually, and then a summary comments page. And then once every individual board member were to finalize their ratings and we had a overall board member rating, then all 5 board members would then be aggregated to create an overall composite evaluation score. All right, so that is part 2 of the evaluation, which is the rubric. I guess we could stop there and have any discussion around the rubric before we move to the annual goals.
Okay, so I want to go through I know we got this in advance, thank you, making today much better. Are there any items on there that you want to tweak, you want to elaborate or expand on? Because this is important. The structure of it I love personally, but when you read through it, is there any other items as mentioned? The superintendent had used some anecdotal things or examples, but do we need any expansions? Mr. Edwards, all right.
Thank you. In terms of the dates that were mentioned at the front end, I know that we talked about we're on target for now, but are there preferred dates that I would, what we've done as a board this time is make ourselves accountable by dates. Mm-hmm. And if we think we want to match data, then we should have that in there to say that on this date, the board will discuss changing the dates.
Are you talking, I'm sorry, is this quarterly milestones? Is this next year? Are you talking the annual milestone?
I'm talking about the timeline right in the very front of this, where we have an October 17th deadline and November 7th.
Page 3.
Right, and I believe you talked about we're good for now, but we may want to match our timelines and evaluations with the data. Is that correct?
That's correct. And my recommendation would be that when you complete an evaluation cycle, you do sort of an after-action review and say, are there any dates we want to change for that it become a normal part of your process? What do you want to change but you also have enough flexibility that if you see something, say, in May,
Right.
that you can bring that up. But I would actually codify that one of the steps is you review the dates and make sure, are you?
That's my point. I really want to hold us as a board accountable to that process.
So in action, an after action report, maybe at the end of the year, so, are we suggesting mid-year evaluate? I mean, I'm not, based on what you just said, it's almost first round, there's nothing that prohibits any board members from saying, hey, you know what, I think it might be prudent that we add an extra timeline on here, et cetera. But perhaps it's at the conclusion of this overall process that we would evaluate the date and the timeline?
So I would recommend you do it at the conclusion of the process, but you have the opportunity to bring things up early, but you have to do it at the conclusion of the process. You go back and review the dates, and you bless them to, yep, going forward, these dates are good, or do we need to go back? Because if you need to go back and change it, you can't just change it here. That requires a contractual amendment. So you have to bring counsel in. My guess is you're going to find your superintendent very amenable to that and go and do that. But I might codify that and even add that in the timeline as one of the steps. Review the dates and determine if there needs to be any modifications.
So I'm okay with it being in the timeline, but would it then need to go back into policy that makes us accountable to, at the end of every evaluation, we're asking ourselves to be more accountable, or?
That would not be a contract component. That would either be policy or practice. You would have to decide, is it practice or policy? That'd be a decision you would make. And I would probably put it in your policy.
I'm good with that.
And I would.
What's not
I wanna
in
make-
policy
Yeah.
doesn't necessarily happen.
Yeah. I just want to make clear too, because I think there's a little confusion about the October 17th. That was actually in the contract, not in the policy.
That's right.
So
It's only dated as a 2023 timestamp, and then it resurfaces onto a more cyclical aspect. But to the point of, at the conclusion of the evaluation, the board shall evaluate timelines, et cetera, to ensure that something to the effect of, I have counsel back there, so they're better at wordsmithing that kind of language. Is that, and then
Yes.
adding that into the timeline here, right?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. And then my second piece, in terms of listening intently to the presentation of, keeping score quarterly, I think was mentioned. And then we have the possible evidence quadrant. I think that there should be some systematic delivery of evidence to the board quarterly of whatever that is. In other words, we need to codify what types of things we should be looking at quarterly so that we're not just evaluating the data at the end of the year, that we've literally, as board members, looked at those milestones.
And I don't, this kind of goes back and forth where we talked about previously having that calendar set out there, and again, maybe as a board and with the guidance or input of the superintendent, what are those core elements? Do we want a quarterly data dump? My guts, I want some key elements like third grade reading, et cetera, instead of all of it. But what does that look like? We want to make sure we're not analysis paralysis, so we're not prohibiting the work to be done, but check-in. So, and I think you already have something like that. Is that right?
yeah, that's correct. I would say in alignment with the state progress monitoring assessment windows, that's where we really, realign the redirection of our work based off the data. So we just completed the first window for Progress Monitoring 1, and so that data is now available, and then that will be shared with the board, and that could be one of those time check-ins, right? Where are we at with Progress Monitoring 1, and then in January, and it'll probably be closed at the beginning of February for Progress Monitoring 2, we will have another data set to see that we can compare from the beginning of the year to mid-year, and then obviously the third being the final. So that to me seems like a reasonable cadence to have some state It gives us a little bit of comparison how we're doing compared to our counterparts across the state, even though we don't get a breakdown by district, but it gives us that data dump. So I would say aligning it to the state progress monitoring windows would make a lot of sense.
And then, are there other items within there that we want to add? So saying, okay, so we know we're going to look at some of the academic outcomes, but there are some operational ones or what have you, and then can we identify what those are so the superintendent and team know what those are, and then we line them to the PM, P1, P2? Is that?
Yeah, I was going to say there's finance reports that we should be seeing along the way to making sure that we're on target for our budget goals. Clearly, we're building schools. You've added a professional learning. All of those components, I would want to see, and that's been it's been a challenge along the way, so that and again, it doesn't have to be just on that quarter so that we're not getting a data dump. It could, every month we're getting some kind of information that keeps us flowing towards your evaluation.
Thank you. I would say also in the plan to forecast out our workshops, there will be regularly scheduled strategic plan updates. And I think a lot of the KPIs that will come out of the refreshed strategic plan are going to hit. And in accordance to what you guys settle on too, is what do we want to monitor as a part of our strategic plan? So I think, financial reports, construction updates, professional learning opportunities that teachers are taking advantage of. We can capture that in KPIs with the strategic plan that'll link back to the evaluation that I think could serve as not only an update for the public and for the board in terms of strategic plan progress, but linking that to the evaluation, I think, may serve in both capacities.
And as such, that each of these, Tom, to your point, in the possible evidence, then to avoid having to go back and change this language per se, knowing that we're still waiting after the 100-day and getting the updated KPIs on the strategic plan, this would reflect that we would be able to measure upon that. Is that?
Yes.
Okay.
Typically, the best case, I see there are three things linked. It begins with the possible evidence that the superintendent puts to their best knowledge the date that information will be available.
Okay.
Like, parent, staff, or student surveys, we do a parent survey, it's in April. If we're going to move it from April, I tell you all, we're moving it from April. But when those things are there. But that doesn't mean you're going to exactly get it all in April. You have to agree on what you need to get, because you don't want him to do a full-blown eval 4 times a year.
Yes.
Because at some point,
Right.
you're not doing any work.
That's my point.
You're just doing that.
Exactly.
But you should know when is the data available. That's just for transparency. You should then use strategic plan updates to get your main updates, but there should be select other items that aren't in the strategic plan that you need the regular cadence. So it might be this. Every quarter, we're going to check for facilities on time and within budget. You should want it on time and within budget. For finances and your spending, whatever your financial points you want to see, we're going to get these periods. And then there are other things you might not want to check all the time, but you might say, during the second update, we'd like some info on this piece with transportation. During the third update, we just like a little, and you get into cadences when you know that throughout the course of the year, you are regularly monitoring all of the major systems of the district as part of that cadence. The places that do that well, in every meeting, you're getting little pieces of it, all in alignment with the strategic plan.
Which naturally helps the entire organization, because then they know and have full visibility, and that's where the accountability trickle down.
Yes, but one other piece, though, you all, though, have to have the self-restraint when you say, well, I'd like to know that now. But wait a minute, we said we're doing that in February.
Right.
We're not going to every time move stuff up. We got a calendar. It's coming.
That's a good point.
So,
Mrs. Rose.
Thank you, Madam Chair. You spelled it out well, what I was going to point out. I would like to see it simplified so that it brings us together and is clear to the community. And I'm very much in agreement with the backup of what equals a most successful district is dividing it into the strategic plan, the departments, and the schools, and having some very focused indicators that are high impact. considering in my individual observation and experience that our weakness is our foundation. So those pieces with specific dates of a key indicator within each, and then moving towards that scoreboard, which we haven't had, that I think will be how well are those three pieces doing, the strategic plan, the departments, and the schools, that foundation. And I think that we need to come to agreement on what that looks like versus each of us as board members adding to a list. To have the greatest impact, he has to, as CEO, spend his time in, I love the way this is laid out in the strategic plan, the departments, and the schools. That has to happen before that scoreboard is going to have movement, but yet at the same time, very strategic, simplified. We can understand it, the community can, we're in agreement, and we can start to see the scoreboard, student data, which is what it's all about, move.
Agreed.
I would like to make one note that the possible evidence is a non-exhaustive list. So if we start a new initiative that we haven't thought about at the time that this is formally adopted, that there is the ability to add to those possible evidences as things change and we're doing different initiatives, that the blue shaded area, again, not exhaustive, that was just a starting point and can be added to along the way depending on need.
Any additional comments?
I do.
Yeah, go ahead.
I like the indicators that you have in the blue shaded area to start out with. I would be looking for, as we've talked about, simply expectation dates of when it would be reasonable to get feedback on those indicators, as well as the student performance, as Dr. Gorman has referred to it as the scoreboard. When would we have the expectation of seeing that added to this?
And where's the appropriate place for that? Is it under possible evidence? And when we're talking about, because it sounds like a lot about the check-ins and dates, where is the most appropriate place to be putting that? Or what would you recommend?
The first place is you list it under possible evidence when it's available, and then the superintendent brings to you when then he could publish that and put that out. By the way, for an aligned system, then he's going to backward map that.
Yep.
It might go to
Right.
in their eval and their following, Rachel and others, that, okay, they're going to do that, and then it trickles to there, to there, to there, because when it's aligned, it happens.
Exactly.
When it's not aligned, then you're into lack of predictability. Yep, so they should be demanding to know, your superintendent should actually be getting it from both sides for clarity.
Clear?
Rubric? Yep.
Are you guys good? Any additional comments? Okay.
Okay, we're going to move into part 3, which was the annual objectives / goals, which begins on page 14. So what I've done here is I've done a 3-year increment just to get the conversation started. And of course,
15.
looking at, page 15.
My bad.
So starting on page 15, you'll see annual objectives. So it's for school year 23-24, which is this current school year. This is the year of what I call setting the stage, laying the foundation, putting the systems, the processes, the structures in place for a successful future for our district. So as you can see, as a part of the annual objectives here, and I limited them to a few. I didn't have a laundry list of objectives, so that's obviously at the purview of the board, which you want to hold me accountable to. But I started obviously with the evaluation. I believe is a very comprehensive document that is going to encompass a lot of data, a lot of documents, evidences, and support of my effectiveness as a leader of the organization. And so achieving a composite rating of effective or higher was something that I put at the very top in terms of an objective. So tying that to the incentive, because this, a part of the employment contract the incentive bonuses are tied to these objectives. So I started with 20% of the incentive would be related to that. And then looking at the next one, we have a transition plan, which we're in the midst of. I'm executing that plan, and we'll have a comprehensive report to share with the public and with the board December-ish. We'll get through the 100 days, and those are 100 actual work days, not 100 calendar days. So that would be executing that plan and coming up with that comprehensive needs assessment report at 15%. And you can see some evidences of progress and completion there. I have a tracker that I'm holding our team accountable to making sure we accomplish. The status reports that I've been giving at our board meetings, the transition plan findings report, which will come at the end of the transition. And then developing effective board governance processes to cultivate strong, productive, professional, and child-centric relationships with the school board. I think we've done a lot of good work as a team in relation to this, and just in the short time. We've had a retreat. We've developed some calendars. We've created some policy review cycles. We're forecasting our workshops. We've approved a communication plan that we're abiding by. We're working together collectively, and I think those systems and processes are working well, but I'll leave that up to you to also evaluate as well. For the next one, you have a system of monitoring school-based instructional practice to improve student achievement. Our team has been, and I got to give kudos to our team, they have been working extremely hard right now. We have put a lot of investment to working with our school-based leaders and our district staff, working hand in hand with our school-based staff to put in what we call a focus framework for advancing school performance. And we'll probably dedicate some time at a future workshop to really go into depth to show you what we're doing in support of schools on instructional improvement. That has also resulted in every school having an impact review, which is an instructional review process where we go in and look for trends and patterns across the classrooms and grade levels and specific content areas, and talk about action plans to help support the school. It's not an audit, it's not a got you, it's really a partnership with the school to talk about the connection between what's happening at the district needs to be seamless with the school base. We shouldn't have people up here in the district sitting in cubicles or in offices not connecting directly with our schools. And so this impact review really helps in that process. And there's some really good evidence of that progress happening with our action plans. And then, of course, progress monitoring data. So that whole system and structure for instructional improvement is there. And then there are the evidences of completion that we'll share with you as well. Developing a revised strategic plan. I am forecasting that as I get through the end of the transition, we'll have a transition report for you December-ish. That January, February, we will have the first draft of a refreshed strategic plan. And then obviously we'll have some workshops and discussion around what that looks like moving forward as a board. We are also, and I think this is a good time as the superintendent evaluation is being codified, we are also in the midst of updating and revising our administrator and our teacher evaluation systems. So this goes back to the point Pete talked about in alignment, that we are aligning our expectations from the superintendent, district staff, school-based leadership, and teacher evaluation. So that alignment is there. So evidence of having both of those rubrics, the administrator rubric and the teacher rubric, would document success there. And then lastly, the revision of the organizational structure. This board understands that we've got to have aligned systems at the top to help support the district adequately and effectively, and you have allowed me to do that through that organizational chart that we've done really early on, and that is setting ourselves up for success this year with systems and processes. So then we can turn to years 2 and year 3 to really talk about moving the needle academically for students. And that's where you'll see in year 24, 25, and 25, 26, you're going to see what I would call the achievement indicators. So our district ranking, as calculated by the total points earned in the state accountability system, So when you look across all school districts and you look from reading proficiency and all those cells that the state looks for accountability, reading, math, lower quartile, gains, graduation rates, acceleration rates, that indicator would be that we're moving the needle to get us to the top. My ultimate, dream, goal, aspiration is to make Sarasota County #1 school district in the state of Florida. That's going to take some time, but we're working aggressively to move us there, and that comes through that ranking system, because that's the only way, apples to apples, we can compare ourselves to other school districts. Third grade proficiency, we've talked about that ad nauseum. That is by far a big indicator for us. So moving that proficiency, increasing that, or I said ranking. Oh.
I do the same thing.
I do the same thing. I will say ranking, and the reason I put ranking is, I will tell you, the way that the state is moving cut scores, they're changing how, we have a new assessment, we have new cut scores, and we don't know what the future holds in terms of changing. And when that happens, when you move those things in an accountability system, it changes thresholds, and it changes the kids who may be proficient. You may be 70% proficient under these cut scores, but now that we've moved the mark, and I will tell you, tomorrow the state board meets and they're moving the cut scores up higher, that means we're going to probably experience lower proficiency rates. Does it mean more students are reading at not proficient levels? Not necessarily, not if you look back at the old cut scores, but it's just raising that bar. We have to have an understanding. That's a context and a reality that every school superintendent and school district experience, and to ignore that fact is I believe not a prudent thing to do. So that's why I include the ranking, because it ranks us against every district in the state. So if we're improving, while we may have dropped a point in proficiency based on new cut scores, our ranking improved. That's telling us we're doing better as it relates to those across the state, if that makes sense.
And if I'm going to, because we talked about that, and I'm glad we're talking about this on the front end, because if you don't talk about it on the front end and you do it on the back end, it looks like you're making excuses, and that's obviously not the goal. And I don't care what industry, to be able to evaluate growth, you want a baseline. And so we don't have control over DOE or any of those changes, but as an institution, as an evaluation or what have you, to have some tracking in addition to, so that we can see, okay, yes, the state evaluates us this way, but we are able to have a baseline and evaluate it that way. I'm glad you brought that up, because it's important that the community know that as best as possible. The district and staff, from a morale standpoint, understand that's how we're looking at it as well. Karen?
Thank you, Madam Chair. I just want to reflect what Superintendent Connor is saying and reinforce it. The ranking, in my opinion, and we've done that for years, we did it as principals, I did it when I was a principal, it allows you to compete with yourself and see how you move. But I'd like to ask the question, but I believe it's fair to say that our comparable ranking is very genuine versus changing the proficiency scores that the DOE is in the process of doing. But if we compare rankings, is it fair to say that that is a reflection of the strength of our systems that Dr. Gorman has separated out and simplified for our community, from the strategic plan to the departments to the schools and the scoreboard of student performance? So I really have always relied on that comparable state of Florida ranking to judge ourselves against ourselves and other districts. And my question is it to Dr. Gorman and Superintendent Connor fair to say that that relative ranking is a strong reflection of the strength of our systems?
It is, as well as it gives you a fairer look at what you consider to be your peer group. Because, so for example, when I was superintendent in Charlotte, North Carolina, I compared against Fairfax County, Virginia, Gwinnett County, Georgia. There was there was a group of places that were the cohort. This gives you a more apples to apples comparison.
Controls a little bit for the fluctuations or the decisions made at DOE in terms of cut scores and all of that, I believe, as well.
Mr. Edwards.
Thank you. I'm not 100% sure that we're all saying the same thing, and we may be. It's very frustrating for my tenure on the board that the data bars are in constant flux, dependent upon what happens at the DOE and what testing gets changed. And I've heard in our data conversations over and over again, oh, well, in this year we had that test and then we couldn't compare it to that. And so what I am looking for, and I appreciate how Ms. Rose ranks, but I think for the public and for the Sarasota family is that we need to have a yardstick or a dashboard that we can compare year over year, regardless of the testing. And I'm assuming it's in proficiency. I'm assuming it's in ways that every year we can go to 3 indicators of academic achievement that the public gets. It's not related to the DOE and not related to testing, and I know that's a challenge. I know I'm asking for, but there should be something simple that we as Sarasota can say we've maintained or we've improved here. I know it's a challenge.
Yeah, I totally agree. I love the idea of what you're saying there, and I would say that without trying to over-assess and maybe create something that we believe in this district is going to give us the year-over-year comparison and show us how we're progressing is the challenge, right? It's, we are already mandated to have so many assessments, and then to think about that without burdening the schools. I think we can think through that as an option. Or do we use the state data and we create our comparisons? We know we get scale scores, and even though the cut scores for proficiency may change at the purview of the DOE, we can compare previous scale scores to current scale scores and see how many are improving. So we could there are ways that districts could create their own kind of progress monitoring outside of the fluctuations of the DOE. But that could, I would want to have someone that has a expertise in that to create that. So yeah, it's a challenge for sure. And
I think it's a question that we should continue to ask ourselves.
Right. Well, and I think there's an element of transparency, sorry, I didn't mean to cut you out, that where there is an element with all of this, to your point, because there is that changeover, and I've seen it and experienced that same frustration too, and in time kind of learned why there is cut scores. Some are ingenuous and some in my opinion, some seem disingenuous, but for the ability of saying, listen, this is how they have changed it. Had we left it as a status quo from the year before, this is what proficiency would have looked like. But, if you ranking, I think illustrating them without trying to create additional, and again, this is not my area of expertise per se, but I think we are all saying the same thing of finding a way to transparently share that, not only for us as a board, the future board, but the community, and I think through proficiency and ranking. And I don't know, this says or, perhaps we have it and, I'm not sure, as an opportunity to guarantee. We know the guarantee is that the cut scores change. So if there's a way that we can consistently illustrate what that would have been with the baseline of 23, 24, moving ahead, no matter understanding those cut scores may be different, 25, 26, 27, 28, always having kind of that baseline so that, because I think it also helps the public understand what the district and staff and all of those individuals are up against, and that we're not trying to pull the wool over their eyes. Yeah.
Thank you. I think that is a question that has been asked for many, many years. My caution is, because working here in this district and trying to come up with that kind of answer has placed a big burden on the people that deal with the data, and it becomes very confusing to the public. So in that quest of not being confusing, it does cause confusion because we're putting in then our own interpretation. So I think we need to just do a better job of communicating to our public however you want to do that at the beginning of the board meetings, to do that. But I think to come up with another kind of data reporting is going to be more confusing, and that's the last thing I want to do, and add extra work to people. So I would like you to come up, and this is just me, I'm individual board member, but a way to explain to the public how we're coming and what our progress is, and letting them know of the changes. Because of all the years of trying to come up with what Mr. Edwards was, and it's not a criticism, but it just creates more confusion and more work, and it doesn't really accomplish that much of letting the public know.
Mrs. Rose?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Changing cut scores isn't new. It's repetitive over time, and something that we're accustomed to. I think it's a matter of explaining it, being transparent, communicating, and the ranking is something that we've also always done so that you can see it through a light that the cut scores don't directly impact. I, as one board member, don't want a new system of explaining scores, because in the end, which system is which system? And ultimately, at least my goal has always been, we're accountable to the state standards and benchmarks and what students need to know and what they're able to do. And I would like to focus in on that as one board member. Looking at cut scores, looking at rankings aren't unique to Karen Rose. They are something we've traditionally done as a school system for multiple decades, because it evens out the changes in cut scores, because you are relative to like districts. For example, I would compare to like middle schools as a middle school principal, so it's not unique to me at all.
So I mean, if I were to summarize, without making an abundance amount of work, if there is a way in which we're able to articulate that, I don't know that that would be incorporated into an additional measurement, but certainly I think to the behest and benefit to everyone, if there is a way, if we have, because of the ever-changing, if there's a way to be more transparent and assist there without burning staff. Just a thought. Okay.
All right. So, thank you. And so going back to page 15, we see 23, 24. Chair, I'd open it up to any discussion to those particular objectives, if we're good with those, or we want to change them or add to them, delete any.
All right. So I will, Mrs. Rose, do you have any on the 23, 24, page 15? Are there any changes? This is really where the rubber meets the road, if you will. So.
No, I do not. Thank you for asking.
Mrs. Marinelli.
No.
Mr. Edwards.
Yes, thank you.
Yep.
What I don't see here is a reflection of where we are financially. We have a hiring freeze, and we are facing ESSER dollar challenges. So just in quick notes as I was taking here is that I think there needs to be some sort of financial review process. I think primarily one area that I think we need to be looking at is in and around HR and the hiring freeze specifically. An ESSER dollar update. I don't know that it has to be monthly, but it could certainly have some sort of indication quarterly. Enrollment, I think, is another question that I know I've been asking for a long time about the comings and goings of students, particularly in and around HB1, and the reasons for coming back or leaving, I think, is important data for us to want to have. And lastly, I know, again, this is something that I've been asking for, is the discontinuing of a particular position. In other words, we don't need that anymore, we've re-engineered it, we moved it here, and programs. The same sort of thing. We don't need that particular reading program any longer because people are using this, or all of those kinds of things that I think we really need to, not just because of the financial challenge, but those financial threads should be part of your evaluation process on a year to year to year. I just got more specific to 23, 24.
So in hearing what you said, I'm trying to determine an outcome-based objective here. So is it providing an update? Is it, so in years 24, 25, for example, maintaining that fund balance above the 7.5% would be an outcomes-based objective. Is there something that I could work on, some outcomes-based language related to what you suggested?
I think that ESSER dollar, we know how much that is. So I think that we have to have some sort of accountability as a board with you that either the program is being replaced or not being replaced, or the position is not being refilled. And how that puts us into the 24-25 program. And I think that we know what the ESSER dollar amount is. My concern is that because we're so focused in these conversations on academic achievement, and rightfully so, that there's no accountability for you and the board, and I'm not sure what the metrics is on the issues that I've mentioned here, the hiring freeze, the ESSER dollars, the enrollment piece. We can at some point, I think, begin to say that we want our enrollment to be at a certain amount. I mean, that's always been the challenge every time I've asked for what could go wrong with a budget, and the answer has always been our enrollment number could be off. Well, guess what? Our enrollment number is off, and so now what are the systems and processes that will go into effect to manage the vicissitudes of enrollment?
I got some comments, but I heard, so I see all, so I don't know. Does anyone want to comment on that? Because I have some thoughts.
I think there needs to be clarification on enrollment. My understanding
Your mic?
was,
Yeah, it is.
yeah, it is. Thank you, Madam Chair. My understanding was that we didn't meet the projections. However, the difference where we landed last year was 200 students. Is that correct?
Yeah, it would be
Under 200 students. So I'm not sure what the concern is with that.
Well, I think if I'm understanding the request, and you can clarify, using something like a metric, whether it be fund balance, because when you talk about ESSER funds and you talk about landing that plane, sunsetting programs, sunsetting positions that are on that grant, that all does at the bottom line affect the finances of the district. And so what I'm trying to draw out of the request is how can we convert that into an outcomes-based metric that you can hold me accountable to. Fund balance comes to mind because if we don't sunset those positions, they go on to the general fund and your fund balance gets eaten up. And so that's where my head goes in terms of coming with, if we talk about terms of finances, that you could hold me accountable to ensuring that we have a healthy fund balance. And encompassing that is so many different layers: staffing allocations, position control, ESSER, landing the ESSER grant, all of those things that you've talked about, I think can be encompassed in something like that.
I'm happy to start there, and I always take time to digest the process, and I know Dr. Gorman would say, if we give him the goal, it's not our job to tell him how to do it, but to stick with the guideline. So I'm happy to start that or stick there, but I'm going to leave it open if I have any other ideas or suggestions.
Okay.
Mrs. Marinelli.
I have to disagree. I'm sorry, these are all important things, but I do not think it's part of the evaluation process. I think that we as a board establish what the fund balance is, but it's up to the superintendent to determine how he wants to get there and brings that for our approval. And then to put in an evaluation of how many students are going to be there, we have no control. From what I've been told, these students, these families moved out of Sarasota. If they move back, they move back. But you can't set a goal for the superintendent that we're going to have so many kids, and then they move away and he's held accountable. I'm sorry, I can't support any of that going into the evaluation piece. Those are things that we as a board need to work with the superintendent on, but it is not part of the evaluation piece, and I would not support that at all. I look at this as, if the state of Florida has said this is what these standards are, then I'm good with that.
So what I've heard, and I'm not sure that I heard anything about enrollment numbers per se in what you're requesting. I think you were good with
This is the impact of a financial, I think.
the financial impact was the starting place.
We don't know until people.
I would like to answer that question, but I have to talk about decorum and discussion amongst board members. It's okay to disagree, but I don't really enjoy being preached at. So if we can have some decorum and some guidelines, I would appreciate that.
Well, I would
Wait, I'm sorry,
too.
wait,
Thank you. I
so,
would too.
let's go back to this. I know Mr. Enos also had a comment as well, and then we'll wrap around so to see if the superintendent has clarity if there are any additions or changes. Mr. Enos.
Is this on? What I would say is that I was the only thing that I was going to point out here. I don't think that being especially in the financial areas, I agree with only one thing, is that we should have something in there that says that you're a good steward of, fiduciary, you have a fiduciary responsibility to be able to be within the limits that is set by the budget of the board, but it's still going to be up to, as in the documentation that Mr. Edwards says, that it will come down into when you're doing the report, what are we looking at enrollment, where we are with our stuff, what are we doing for ESSER, because I don't think that those are necessarily an objective, as the overall objective would be that you have good fiduciary responsibility and you keep and maintain it within the budget as presented by the board, because ultimately that still gives you the leeway. So let's say then you made a decision that you were going to put, I don't know, you wanted to put my name on billboards all over the county. I mean, that would be great, useful money, but probably not the best that our community would agree with, or our board members. So what I would say is that I still think in that piece, as that was the only thing I was going to bring up, I think especially when we look at the times, especially with the ESSER dollars, especially with the referendum coming up, especially with what our budget looks like, especially with building new schools, making the bond, all of that is encompassing, but I think it should be an overall objective of you can have the fund balance in there of 7.5%, even though it's set by the board. But I would look at it more being is that your fiscally responsibility with your fiduciary responsibility to the budget that was set by the board for the year. And then that, because I think that is kind of what we're talking about, is that we just want to make sure that we're within those guidelines, and how are we making those changes, which I think ultimately comes back to the updates that you would give us, which is the documentation, which would be the HR report, which would be any amendments to the budget, anything. The detail and actually the financial ledgers is what we would want to see, and how you're going to be able to do that, because ultimately you'd be the one coming to the board with the responsibilities. So I would just use it as an objective in all of this. I think it's excellent. I would just say that the financial thing, because ultimately we are, since we're accountable for the fiduciary, ultimately then you're accountable to how we're spending the money to a certain level. So that's why I would say that just piece has to be in there. But I don't think as an objective to put it in there at 7.5%, because ultimately the board could then change it to 8. We could change it to 9. We could put it at 5. Because then that wouldn't be reflective upon you, because that's the decision, but overall the general operations of being a good financial fiscal steward, having that fiduciary responsibility to the citizens of Sarasota County, I think that's easily obtainable, because how do you provide that? Exactly what Mr. Edwards says. This is what we're looking at enrollment. This is what we're looking at for the detail. This is, because then I think that's how you would build that to show that you are being a good financial steward of tax dollars and funding from the state.
So I would agree that having an annual objective, let me try that again, an annual objective of evaluating or checking in on the financial health of the district. I think that's a very big, important responsibility as elected officials. That is one of our primary duties. To go to Mr. Connor's statement of what is that measurable metric, and how do we put that in here? I'm not sure I don't know that I have an answer, but I think a lot of the items that were supplemental to evaluating that were kind of what came up. So in interest, and also for the programmatic review process, I wrote that down because I do like that's something we've had a problem with over the years. But in then hindsight, I took a step back and saying, well, that's going to really actually illustrate itself both in the financial health of the district and in the academic outcomes, which are already reflected here absent a financial check-in. So if you have some kind of recommendation of how we would have it from an annual objective, what should we be looking at? A balanced budget, 7.5, fund reserve balance, or that's already, to your point, already in policy. But I do think it would be prudent to have some kind of financial check-in on the overall evaluation.
And I would request that Mr. Connor can obviously get with staff and to be able to come back with what would that ultimately stay, then talk to us and our one-on-ones to be able to come back to us. So we still would be doing another 7th. So we'd be able to have at least some kind of, give the direction. We're all looking for the same thing. I just don't know if you just say it has to be 7.5%, because if you just say, hey, it has to be 7.5%, well,
right.
You know what I'm saying? Like you have to be able to have the detail.
There's a lot of different levers that play a role in the financial health. Dr. Gorman, did you have a thought?
Yes, so I was going to say, I understand your point. You're going to want to review annually the 7.5% based on conditions and what goes on, but setting 7.5% for a target is a good target. But what you could also do for this year is you could also add on to it, and you expect the superintendent to put in place a clear and transparent, rational plan for how the ESSER fund reductions in CLIF will be dealt with. You want them to have a plan. You want to be able to make it clear. You know what it is. You know what's going to happen. That'd be more of an input. Why is it an input? It's a one-time.
Right.
Right, I agree.
So it's a one-time, but you just want to know it's being addressed.
So
There's a
develop a
plan.
plan.
People are going to know. You're not telling them how to do it. You have a plan. We want to see the plan. But you're not going to micromanage it. But that's a market condition of right now, which I think is part of what you're saying is there's going to be market condition. We could, God forbid, we go into a recession at a later time. We have to do crazy stuff can happen. So you may monitor these. You may add stuff. That'd be a one-time thing for now with the ESSER cliff, I would say.
And I would also just follow up. I think that this is me. I mean, especially because out in the community, I would think that the finance piece would be a recurring objective every year as it goes forward. You can get into the detail on the ESSER because that's specific. But ultimately, I still think that, as we discussed about putting actually on each school and what are the tax dollars, because as you looked in references to Sarasota County and state, everybody wants to have that transparency with the finance. This, again, just holds that to me as that subjective is we're going to be transparent. I like that word in regarding to our finance and our responsibility. And, we can add in the ESSER, but I think in some way it should be in that every year is that you're following basically comes down is you're following the budget and the recommendation of the board. That's really what I'm trying to
Right. So, like, for example, if we have contracts, we've talked about this. This has not, by the way, not happened under his tenure, but nothing coming to the board that we're authorizing that's already basically happened, right? And that's a financial. I mean, those are financial responsibilities of us as taxpayer dollars, being stewards of taxpayer dollars. So having some kind of check-in financially, I think yes would be recurring. I will, however, say I do like, for a one-off year of saying develop a plan so it's transparent and clear, not only for the board, because that's our responsibility, but for the community to know as it relates to ESSER funds, because it is so substantial and very few, I don't think many districts are looking at it as closely as they should be. So did you have any follow-up?
Yeah, I just wanted to say that when I looked at 2024, and I know that we talked about this in our one-on-one, that this year is very hard to make it measurable because it's the get acquainted year. It's the superintendent reset, trying to come in and do all of that work. But what was lacking in this space was some sort of financial accountability. And what I was merely doing, which I will try to control, was free-form thinking, ESSER dollars, enrollment, all of the kinds of things that might be measurable in terms of that are specific to this year. So I appreciate Dr. Gorman saying that ESSER dollars is a specific challenge, and I am happy, as I said, to continue to sort of digest what other financial measurements we can look at going down the road. But ESSER, I'm satisfied with the ESSER dollar conversation because that's a big piece of what we're dealing with this year.
All right.
And if I may wrap up, just to be fair to you, what that clarity is, something to come up with so that prior to us adopting this, that we're all clear, you're clear, so it's not, hey, we thought this was, something was inferred and it's not clearly dictated. So I just want to make sure if there, as that being added on, that's all.
So what I hear the board collectively say, and I do want to bring forth too, just to reassure you, in the rubric itself, when you look at operations under Standard 3, 3.1, you're going to annually assess me on managing the fiscal resources in a responsible and ethical manner, engaging in effective budgeting and decision-making and accounting practices. So that will be an annual thing each and every year. The goals will be very metric outcome-based goals. So
I see.
that would be an ESSER plan. I can develop, what I hear from the conversation is we add a component that says develop a plan, a report of what we're doing in terms of effectively landing the ESSER budgets, and what the plan is as a result of the positions that are there, what will be sunset, what will be continued and sustained maybe on other revenue sources, those types of things. Am I clear there?
Yes, and I appreciate you highlighting the annual and recurring under Standard 3 as it pertains to the financial health of the institution operation, but then for the goals of a unique goal, and then looking at that by way of landing the ESSER dollars. Is there any feedback? Yes.
Thank you. I just want to be careful in this process that I think that having an enrollment count is something I always like to have, and that the metric is perhaps in reoccurring check-ins, which we do have, but when to expect those and what they might include. What do the outcomes look like? I'm looking to you to, at what point do we start turning this evaluation into including operations? I just want to be careful with where we go forward. We had the retreat with you, and I understand and respect the check-ins that my colleagues want. I want to know what enrollment is and at certain points, and I want check-ins on and transparency with all aspects of the finance and the budget. But at what point are we delving further into operations and putting it in the form of an evaluation and or not? I'm just looking for that clarification.
So there's a couple pieces that come with that. One is, if you take a look at page 6, you're doing operations under Standard 3, school operations. I would be hesitant about, and I understood your point that enrollment impacts finances, therefore you want to monitor, you want to track that. So that's something you should always expect him to be looking at. And then as there's legislative changes with the ability to cross-county, there's a myriad of things. So, yep, that's definitely something to be considered. So I think that's covered in item 3. You're going forward after this year of the 7.5% that's been put out there as a target for now. You may have to evaluate that later, but for this year, just use the ESSER plan for this year for how to do that, and then reallocate the percentages here. If that's one of the goals, he would have to reallocate and bring back because you can't have more than 100% unless you're willing to. Yep, sorry, Mr. Superintendent. But he would have to bring back something that's reasonable with that. But you would really drive down on that on item number 3 with the regular check-ins. Yep, but that's a great point. You got to be effective and efficient with your business operations. But you should ask to look at your enrollment numbers beginning of school, and then when second semester starts, you should want to look again, and then you should want to see them end of school. Where do you start? Who's there for second semester? And largely, there's still, how many FTE weeks are there?
5.
I would probably want to get them during the FTE weeks just because that's when cash comes. Yep. Yep. So you're right on target with that.
So can you summarize what you just said relative to where we're going so we can come to an agreement? Because I'm not sure we're all in the same space. And what we're adding or not adding, with what specificity. I just think that, for me, I'm very cautious of at what point do we move this evaluation into monitoring more than.
Well, it doesn't change any of the standards, but in the goals, there's the addition of the ESSER plan for the funding spend down, and there is a reallocation of the percentages that the superintendent will get back to you and do that. And then he should also come up with a date when he's going to get you the you're going to see the plan for what the process is for ESSER review, which the finance shop is already
Doing.
But in your goals, you're holding it accountable. Yep.
So, and we're in agreement with that?
Yeah, I just, because these are such significant goals that are really, really, I think, it really collects a lot of the comments all of us have said over the past year to the superintendent. And this is not to diminish the ESSER priority. I do think it is an important one. And it's great for it to be full visibility. The one point is just the percentage. My suggestion, not to diminish its importance, but in comparison to some others, I would not want to see it go higher than like a 5%.
I would be careful. The bigger percent you put something, human nature is, the more time,
That's my point.
energy, and effort he puts on.
That's my point. So but I do want feedback and for him to come back and calculate that, because to where you take the 5% away, where is that coming from as well? So to be fair, since this is what he developed, do we have feedback on thoughts, or do we want to wait for him to bring that back to us? I open it to my colleagues. Mr. Enos.
Yeah. I would just, again, I would ask him to bring it back to us and be able to put it in the wordsmith to get with Dr. Gorman and put the whole thing together, so then would be evaluated as we're moving forward, because I think I would say as this board members, we're on the same page. It has
Beating
the
a dead horse.
financial and the ESSER, so I think we're all on the same
Small.
thing.
I said, okay, that's what, yes. I think small, but reflected visually. Okay, are we moving on?
Okay, so that is the end of this school year. So that timeline would look like by September 1st of 2024, I would complete a self-evaluation that would be distributed amongst board members to review along with the evidence. And then by October 1st of 2024, you would complete your evaluation based on the rubric. And then these objectives would be decided, or whether we've met those objectives or not, with the board chair at the time. We would sit down and talk about evidences towards meeting that by October 1st as well. 24, 25, and if you notice at the very bottom, and I think this is up on the screen, we have subject to revision. So I went ahead and did a 3-year just to kind of lay out the foundation. We don't have to do that if the board would rather just stick with 23, 24 and not worry about 24, 25 or 25, 26 yet, and we can look at it at a later date. But I think that's where we transition to a student outcomes-based objectives on that I'd be evaluated on. So obviously I've went through this already, but just district ranking, third grade proficiency, overall reading proficiency, math proficiency. I believe there's an opportunity, and this would address subgroup performance with our lower quartile in reading and math as well. And then we may want to address the last one, since we've had some conversation around the fund balance and what that looks like in terms of an outcome in 24-25. So these are basically the same in 24-25 and 25-26.
Thank you. Mrs. Rose?
Thank you. I, as one, would like to see that forecast to continue the 3 years, in that the more proficient and tight our systems and processes become, the most highly effective districts are going to be working ahead and planning a year into the future and beyond. So I very much would like to see those. It doesn't mean, obviously, that there can't be modifications, but I think we would be remiss as one individual to not have that forecast.
I concur. I think it's full visibility it's obviously subject to change, as it says that, but it gives a very clear indication of where we're headed. I also think for the community, it helps them understand, again, new superintendent, a lot of these are foundational processes that we're putting forth, but it's not that our eyes are off of the core academic measurables.
I would also add then at the after action kind of process at the end of each year, you add one more year for the 3 years out. You have a 3-year rolling. And when you do the 3-year rolling, you might not just be doing the third year. You may also say 1 and 2 years out, we've modified, but that this is constant. He should know what his targets are. He should be hiring for it. He should be long-term planning for it. That way you have a
Continuous
foundational
improvement.
view.
What did he say?
Are there any other comments on that? I don't think that we have to belabor that part since it's in the future. Okay?
Okay, and that is the conclusion of the rubric.
We can take the slides down because now we're just heading into a discussion. We don't even need that.
All right.
All right, now for the hard part. How are you going to address variations in scores and outliers? This is a discussion for you. What do you do? How do you handle that when you have variations? What are your expectations? I'm making this up. 5, 5, 5, 5, 1. What are the expectations you have? If he's going to make his thinking visible with what he gives you, how do you all make your thinking visible to each other, the superintendent, and the citizens? How are you going to handle that? What is the expectation? Along with that, which will help hopefully clarify it, what are your expectations for comments? Particularly if you rate something a particular way, I can just put 1 and walk away and not say anything. What are your expectations for how you do this work?
I appreciate
This is the process part where it gets more difficult, and you all have to be transparent with each other to
Gotcha.
do a good job with it. So I'll turn it back to you, Madam Chair.
Thank you very much. Well, first I'll say I appreciate these comments in the beginning. And I do, based on history, understand there may be some differing opinions here, so it's better to flush it out now. So there's full visibility for all of us as a board unit and for the superintendent. So Mrs. Rose, you look like you had a comment.
I did. Thank you, Madam Chair. I would be interested in best practices of highly functioning districts to start a discussion, some examples, and also just my individual opinion that the metrics, the blue column has put things forth that we've all agreed upon, and what are the metrics that go with that we would be writing about to objectify that number, even if it was different. I'm a firm believer in metrics and data, and we have the column in blue. How does that translate? What are the best practices? That's how I would start out this conversation.
So a couple of pieces with it. The first is you all have to commit to doing this process, and it's going to take time. You're going to have to put the time in to look at the data and root it in what the materials you've been given. I feel based on. and have to speak up. What have you based that specifically on? And if you base it on something that is not part of the pre-shared possible evidence, are you using forms of evidence that others aren't using as evidence? And you all should be able to have a robust discussion why you think A, it is evidence, or B, it is not evidence. And you should be able to have that discussion. So that means it's going to take time, it's going to be rooted in evidence, you're going to make your thinking visible, and you're going to cite what evidence that drove you to give. The places that do well, and they do that in a way where they're hard on the topic, but not hard on each. It's rooted in evidence, and you do that.
And if I can add to that, if there are, for example, I'm speaking to the possible evidence and rooted in evidence, but in the event that every foreseeable potential possible evidence may not be explicitly listed
Right.
here, but that if that is something, again, this is what my personal perception of best practices is, sharing that evidence with the entire board and the entire body so that they can discern to what they believe, that impact is on the respective standard that we would be evaluating it. That would just be my recommendation and something we can all agree to. There may be something, some measurable, I don't know, or some state or national or international, I don't know, some kind of data point out there that we weren't considering, but that does have relevance, or at least one board member believe it to do so, and I don't want to take that away from them to do so. My just request is that we all agree that that would be shared with all members so that they can also reflect on it, so that would be kind of balancing the scales.
How do we expect anyone, whether it's a teacher, a principal, a superintendent, to perform at the highest level when they don't know what they're going to be measured on, when they create a strategic plan, when that flows down to departments and to schools and ultimately to the scoreboard of student data? I'm not opposed to having dialogue. I just question, I look for expertise. I know that evaluating my colleagues, teachers, for 14 years, if I would have started evaluating them on something they didn't have up front, it legitimately would have been an issue. And I'm not saying that data sources that we don't have in front of us aren't important, but if we're potentially have the potential to come up with 5 different data sources that we have not given the individual that we're evaluating at the beginning of a year, but we include them for most likely valid reasons at the end of the year, I feel like we're colliding on ourselves, and I look for feedback on that. I'm not saying that there aren't sources of data that wouldn't surface, but at what point do we, I'm frustrated with
Well, I'm
where we
actually
are.
agreeing with you. I'm agreeing with you. If you do use something else, you should say, wait a minute, I used something, we should all say, whoa, how did that come in late, and why didn't we look at that earlier? Why didn't we bring that up? No, I was actually agreeing with you
I'm not
that it
saying
shouldn't
you
be.
aren't. I'm just saying I'm really frustrated with the thoughts of all of our own data sets.
No, I would expect it to be a one-off. I don't think, think it would be, I don't want to eliminate the potential of it, who knows, but, because you don't know what tomorrow is, but I think that because you don't have a foresight into, first of all, I want to clarify, I don't think we're talking about what an individual is being evaluated on. I think we've hashed that out very, very clearly. So it's more of the supporting evidence of what you would come to conclude on that specified item. And if it really is an outlier item that, again, I don't think we have everything listed out here, and I don't want it to make that way, even for the superintendent to provide information to us to evaluate on these specified areas. But if there were something out there, my point being is that to Dr. Gorman's point, that if there is something else, we bring it to and share it with all board members, because then collectively we can hash out the credibility almost of that supporting evidence, but not so it derails us.
Madam Chair,
Yes,
I would
please.
say it's incumbent upon me as a superintendent to provide evidence of how I've accomplished these metrics. So the way I foresee this is that I will complete a self-evaluation along with the supporting evidence and documentation that shows that why I've rated myself, particularly on one of these components, and share that with the individual board members to calibrate and determine, is that sufficient evidence for that particular rating? Oh, I think it may be a higher rating, a lower rating. So I look at the evidence piece more for me to guide how I should demonstrate how I'm rated accordingly. Does that make sense?
I think that what I would say, where in my experience where things have gone awry, is one, we did not have the detail listed out as it is right now and agreed upon, well, for better or for worse, that it is balancing. This is actually mathematically evaluated where we're bringing each board member has a detail. We're signing off on it. We understand the process. There are unforeseen circumstances, certainly. However, I would argue this is comprehensive enough where you're able to, there's always going to be some unforeseen consequence. And even if you let's just use COVID as an example, no one could have possibly predicted that, but every standard in here really would still be applicable as far as the operations, the financial, viability, the academic impact, et cetera, and then whether or not you have more grace in these areas is kind of where, Dr. Gorman, I think is perhaps what you're talking about and what that looks like. And so then maybe board member A is going to be hard-lined more so than board member C. And the question is how much narrative, and Mr. Edwards, just because I know you've said this publicly, when it comes to providing any kind of commentary with a former prior evaluations. You'd mentioned, and I'm not trying to point you out in a negative way. I think it's an important conversation because it's a professional evaluation, and so that level of comfort of saying, you know what, these are the conversations we have in our private one-on-ones. You know, as a board, where do we want to come together as an agreement? What's appropriate to put in your supporting documentation on how how each board member evaluate the superintendent? Do you have? Because I only call you out because I know you mentioned that before, and I didn't know if you had any feedback on that.
Yeah, my personal feeling is, the document is the document, and we're required to do it, but I have those conversations with the superintendent on an ongoing basis about what I like and what I don't like, and that's peer-to-peer collaboration as far as I'm concerned, and as to your point, it's part of the continuous improvement process. If you hold out to the end of the year and say you shoulda, coulda, woulda, that's not helping what we're all trying to accomplish here, which is the high outcomes. And the other piece of this that I think is fair is that there are moments where we actually learn from one another when we're open and honest and we hear each other's point of view. And I hope that spirit continues. Because that's the best part of democracy, that we're all coming at the school board from various backgrounds and have different perceptions. So I'm okay, as I said before, as long as it's okay to disagree.
The other part is, again, I'm looking at this more, it's easier when it's everything coming up roses. It's more preparing for when there's disagreement or perhaps I'm just going to call a spade, is that and this is not even, I'll use past boards just so that no one takes it in personally. But there can be wide disagreements on philosophy or approach or what have you. Really doesn't change the mechanics here. And that can actually be just almost sometimes even a personal relationship, the relationship or inner working relationship with a board member and a superintendent. When is the appropriate time for that to come out? Because that will absolutely impact the evaluation of that superintendent amongst that board member. I mean, that's just the reality. In my personal opinion, a best practice would always be conducting it professionally, giving the superintendent those ongoing conversations privately. But do you wait until the end of the evaluation to let the entire board know where you're standing? Do you do it? I mean, those are the kind of things those are hopefully those are trying to prepare of what that process looks like so that you aren't in a situation where the entire year that's all behind the scenes. I do not want, having sat through that, I do not want to see I do not want to create an environment where we're pushing that out in an ineffective manner at the dais, where there's just a board member and a superintendent kind of clashing. So, but there is that balance of if you have the scenario that Dr. Gorman put forward, and again, I don't perceive this to be the case. I'm just using this as the discussion. If there is some kind of very untilted situation, what do you do? That's where if it's catching everyone off by surprise, just using history as an example, there's really no perfect way to say that it really does lend itself to somewhat of a hostile situation. Hostile is the wrong word, but a dysfunctional ongoing process, or waiting to, or I mean, I actually defer to you. What do you suggest? Because I have seen it go poorly a couple of times.
One of the tools you can use is the quarterly feedback session, where every quarter you have, and can you do the eval in closed session? So it's all open.
But we can talk informally through one-on-ones about the progress that I'm making regarding.
I would just put it as an expectation that there will be some quarterly feedback. And the example I would share is I support a superintendent through a coaching relationship, and a board member said at a meeting, all year long there has been this issue. And the other board member said, no, there hasn't.
Okay.
They said, no, it's been there all year long. And they said, no, there hasn't, because we've had 3 check-ins and you've not brought it up. Mm-hmm. So it couldn't have been in all year long, because we committed as a group, if there's an issue, we're going to bring it up. So I think the piece is, you all commit that quarterly you will bring it up.
Professionally.
And professionally, and there will be some addressing of it, that there won't be that last minute where you hear about something, that you're going to bring it up. And I strongly support what you said. Of the first thing is, I would just, as a board member, I would talk individually with some, this is a concern I have. And then if it continues beyond that, I might bring it up to other board members, board chair, and to address it then. But that is what I would do. I think that's a best case scenario.
I agree.
And I think that there are some pieces around, you should expect that if the rating would be a 1 or 2, there would definitely expect to be some written commentary
I would agree.
for why it is a 1 or a 2. And the written commentary should be linked to evidence, like what it was, or not linked to it, that I don't see it there. So that would be the steps I would have around the greatest concerns. And then that expect that there will be discussion about any item that there is an outlier on. Any item there's an outlier, so we understand the concern or issue. We then address, is that something that's been addressed during the year? Why or why not? And by the way, that can be part of your self-evaluation too. We're not doing our piece to each other because we're not updating on what's going on. And then you address that there going forward. But agreeing to those kinds of terms up front just makes things much clearer, that people know what they're getting.
I concur to that. So, and I think that of all the scenarios I could consider, I think a quarterly check-in allowing for everyone to kind of get on the same page, because we are limited through sunshine, making it somewhat difficult, would be prudent. So, any other comments? Thoughts? Does that?
I do have one comment. I think what we just talked about should be put pen to paper.
Okay.
Look, amnesia happens.
I agree. So I'm fine with that. So if there is, if it's appropriate, the superintendent put a summary together as to what we just said.
I get a feeling I know someone who's going to help him with it, and I'm glad to assist.
Okay.
It could go into policy. I would try it first, but you may want to put that into policy.
Let's see. I mean, I would agree with, let's try to,
Could be on the pathway to it, yeah.
but yeah, because I mean, I have no problem codifying in policy best practices so that so for succession planning, so that you, 100. But I think, to be fair, I haven't seen us do it. I think it's been discussed to that point, so all the more reason to put it pen to paper, and then evaluating at the year end of the timeline of saying, okay, did this work, not, and then codifying it in rule. I think that's not a bad idea.
That is all I had on the part. Those were the topics I wanted to throw out to you.
Does anyone have additional comments on this topic? And then we can. I do not, except I will say, oh, yes, I do. This has been wonderful. Again, having done this a couple of times, very, very comprehensive. I hope that the board feels very comfortable. I hope you feel comfortable with this. And then just for housekeeping purposes, we'll have some of the minor tweaks and then that additional narrative provided to us. And then that will be on the November board meeting.
Yep.
7th. Okay. Dr. Gorman, thank you very much.
Happy to help.
You are very, very helpful. So that concludes the evaluation discussion. Are there any additional items before we recess? And then we have a 6 o'clock board meeting this evening. Well, seeing none, do you have anything? We good? All right. Well, we'll get out of here early. I'm sure people will be disappointed. So thank you again to Dr. Gorman. Thank you to my board members for making this a very productive and efficient use of our time. And we will see you guys tonight at 6 o'clock.